Hello and welcome to this tutorial on the topic on using the Gluware Config Modeling app. Config Modeling is used to build and implement policy-based network automation, leveraging the power of the underlying intent-based and declarative Gluware orchestration engine. So let's get signed into Gluware. If you're taking the test drive, you'll be able to follow along with the steps here. So I'm signed into Gluware. I navigate back into where I exited the app or either signed out or timed out. I'm here in the dashboard view, so I'm going to navigate up to the upper right hand corner to the app switcher and navigate into the model editor. The model editor is where we access config modeling. And when config modeling opens, or the model editor opens in your instance, it may not look exactly the same way. So let me take a few minutes to just describe the model editor and kind of what you're looking at. So to start with, I'm going to close out a bunch of windows and just kind of give you an orientation that you have a main kind of center grid that you're going to work with for these views up across the top. So domains, features, globals, and nodes. We're not going to be doing anything with external scripts at this point. So you have your main primary grid, and it is very similar to the Device Explorer grid, but there are certain differences. And so a few of the common elements are you have a cog to set or turn on which columns are available in your view. So you want to make sure you turn on and turn off different things. One view I would recommend you do turn on that you will be using kind of a lot, and I definitely will refer to it quite a bit in this session, is the assembly policy view. So you can see that here, and currently no assemblies are assigned, and so that grid is that column is blank, but that one we will be using. The other point I would make is that we most of the time orient around the node view. And so within Gluware, a node and a device are kind of used synonymously. In the model editor or config modeling, we refer to devices as nodes. So when you click on the blue N, it'll always bring you back to the node view. And then you have a filter here, which is to filter the nodes by operating system types. So if I do all types, I see all 12 devices that are in this system. And if I filter it back down to the nodes I'm going to be working with in this tutorial, which is iOS routers, I can filter it down there and just see the iOS routers. Similarly to Device Explorer, you have a click-in text-based search. You can also turn on regex, or you can navigate into a filter and filter your grid so if you're looking to do certain things with very certain specific devices in your infrastructure, the filter and the sorting work very well to kind of find those, especially when you're working with large infrastructure of thousands or tens of thousands of devices. So we're in a pretty small lab here, so we don't really have to use the filtering, the sorting, but it's good to know it's there. The other piece with this grid here is that it is you can change the order. If I want to move iOS router and assembly, I can move these around, and they're sortable with the arrow keys as well. So you can sort based on that. So a little bit of just orientation to your grid. The other couple of windows I'd like to bring to your attention are you have a left pop out, a bottom pop out, and a right pop out. The left one you'll probably use the least, but let's go ahead and click on it. And one thing I would say that probably is interesting to at least look at initially is if you're working in Gluware and in your device manager view, you have a lot of devices, different manufacturers and things. But let's say you come into your model editor view and for some reason you don't see certain vendors. It would be because your vendor adapter, vendor extension is for some reason not installed. So Gluware has been kind of like preloading the most common vendor adapters, but we're at about 30 operating systems that we support now. So quite a few of the operating systems are kind of less used ones aren't there. And if you're going to be automating, you need to make sure they're there, otherwise you won't see them. So as you kind of browse across domains, features, globals, nodes, in the high-level nodes view, this information here is showing you all of the vendor adapters that are installed into this instance, and I can, if I navigate to iOS switch, it shows me all the iOS switches. If I navigate to SRX router, I know that I have an XRS router in this configuration. So you can navigate from here as well, but Generally, I recommend to use the drop down up here. And again, we're going to be navigating primarily or using iOS routers in this demonstration. So that's that left panel drop out. There's also something called a type map, but since we've introduced the node map, the type map is a little bit less interesting. It's still interesting, but it's less useful. So we'll talk about that as we bring in features that we're going to automate. So on the bottom pane, you have two things that you might end up using, say, more often. The first on this left-hand side is the terminal window. If you saw a demo before on Drift and Audit, I use the terminal window to connect to a device and make a manual change. Those of us who are still very familiar and comfortable at CLI, maybe we want to do things of validation on the CLI, or maybe for test purposes, we're making unauthorized changes or doing things on the CLI. So you have that access to cut through from Gluware right directly to the devices and access CLI in this window. In this use case, we're not going to be using the terminal window, so I'll go ahead and close it. We are going to be using the node instance map. If I bring up the map, and when you bring up the map, you probably want to zoom in, zoom out. And that being said, a couple quick items of if things aren't looking quite right from a layout standpoint. One is from a browser point of view, you can zoom in or zoom out to make your layout look proper to you. I'm using a bigger monitor. I like it at 90%. It's kind of working for me in this view. But the more, let's say, elements or items I'm trying to work with, I might want to zoom out further. In your node instance map, you can also zoom in, zoom out. I'm using the wheel on my mouse, or you could, if you have a touch screen with a touch with zoom in, zoom out, you can do that. But as we begin to build a map in this picture, you're going to want to understand how you can resize it. So we're going to come back to this, but basically we're going to use a node instance map a lot because it is a visual representation of the kind of data model constructs that Gluware uses in automation. I'll just cover these other two pretty quickly. There is a regular expression window. This is really just here for test and validation. We use regular expressions in numerous places within Gluware. And one of the upcoming tutorials, in fact the next one where we get into state assessment, you're using regex to pull out state when you're executing show commands. But you do have the ability to dump a bunch of output of config or an output of a show command into this box here, and then type your regex here and see if your regex is properly matching on that string or variable, whatever you're trying to pull out. So that's just a regex utility to kind of test it. There is a whole dedicated video on that. And then the last one here is called workflows. And so workflows can be integrated into the model editor, and we're going to see an example of that when we run the intelligent model discovery. It's an integrated workflow, and we're going to do that in an upcoming demonstration. So that one we'll come back to. On the right-hand pop-out, this is really where your kind of actions are. So when you are provisioning, you're going to go into the actions view. When you're looking at logs, you're going to go into the log view. And the other elements here, the details and the instance, we're going to be looking at these a lot. So just to kind of give yourself an orientation in that, it depends on where you're working at within config modeling and what window you need the most real estate. Sometimes it makes sense to close others out or get them out of the way. You can also, if you go down to the setting cog, you can unpin. If you like floating bars, I like to pin the bars up and pin everything where it's visible. You could also have it go floating and have it pop out when you move your cursor over there. So if for some reason you don't see those bars, as you move your cursor over there, the bar should kind of float out, and then you could pin it up. All right, so I think that covers kind of the basics. Now let's get into network automation and the use case we're looking at here. When you think of Gluware and network automation and the model editor, there are numerous layers of complexity that we can get to. What we're trying to do in this session is start kind of small, start easy, and automate some global features. So think about Cisco IOS and Banner and NTP and DNS. So when you start to look at like what is in Gluware, what's built into Gluware, what you're going to find is if you navigate through domains and features and globals, if you are starting from scratch, you may have nothing in domains. If you are starting from scratch, you may have very little in features. I happen to have quite a bit. In globals, you are going to have quite a bit because we do provide the config modeling kits. So just by way of orientation again, when you think about how content gets into Gluware, there are three main ways in the model editor. One is loading via packages, which I'm going to show you. Two is you build things kind of from scratch. We're not going to do a lot of that in this session. And then three is using intelligent model discovery, which will read from a reference device and then build the automation models. In this example, we're working with primarily preloaded packages and preloaded capability, which Gluware can provide for you. So let's navigate back to solution management, and let me talk through a little bit about what you're seeing and what got loaded in. So we are working with Cisco IOS. So one of the pieces you're seeing are layers of content in there comes from the config modeling kit. This package right here, and this package is already installed in there. So the config modeling kit gives us a whole library of what we call concept items. The other thing and we'll get into what they are. The other component you're going to see in there is example features and example assemblies even. So the whole use case I'm doing here is based on automating Cisco iOS globals. So Gluware has created a package, an example package of features called example Cisco globals iOS for router and switch. So I'm actually working with the router one. And so this package has been loaded into the system. And if you're wondering where you can get that package, let me just cover that real quickly. Go to gluware.com/community, navigate into the community page, and sign in. If you don't have access, contact Gluware to get signed up. And then navigate back from the community view to the Gluware view. And in knowledge base, we provide a lot of example content, especially when you're getting started with Gluware, learning how to use it, example audits, example features. So here is where, let me see all articles. So here's where example Cisco router global features, if I click on that, you can download what we call a capsule. This zip file is a zipped up capsule, and then you can load that into your instance, and boom, you're going to have everything I'm showing you in this demonstration. For anyone running the test drive, these are already loaded for you. So that's just context of where to get them. So let's jump back into config modeling here. So here I am, and I want to start to automate. So let me go back to my node view. And right now, again, if I bring up the node instance map, and I start to think about what am I automating, or what am I going to automate, the way Gluware ties what we're automating to a device is through a construct called an assembly. So what we're going to want to do is double click on the device, and I can either double click from the grid here or double click on it from the graphical view here. So if I double click on it, I'm asking Gluware to show me the data model associated with this construct. So this happens to be a CSR router, and if I double click on it, I have a bunch of information that I'm storing and keeping on that router, and this is a data model. If you have access, you can click on the JSON view and see, this is like, we refer to kind of like infrastructure as code. We are turning everything Gluware reads from the network, any devices defined in the network, and all the configuration data is wrapped in JSON-based data modeling. And what you want to do here from your device view is go to the Associations tab, and you're going to associate a assembly with your device. And again, we've preloaded or pre-populated some examples, so we're going to load the example global features and hit save. Once you've done that, you want to click back in your node instance map and zoom out. You're going to have to kind of, probably zoom in or zoom out back to get it into view, because the instance map just redrew with a bunch of content. So what we've just done in a couple of clicks was we took a device, a single device, and we tied an automation policy to it, or a construct called an assembly. And when you think of the assembly, a good analogy we like to use with customers, just a kind of straightforward one, is the assembly is like a shopping cart. And I'm clicked on the assembly, and if I go down my cart, I can see I have a banner feature, I have a DNS feature, I have NTP, I have SNMP, I have syslog, I have username. And if you float over these, you have X's, and you can remove features or you can add features. So getting into that a bit, features are these red boxes, and features are the container that it contains all the specific things about your implementation of the banner feature, or your implementation of DNS, or your implementation of NTP. So let's take a look at a couple examples. Again, I'm going to click on banner, and what you're going to notice here is most of the features in this example are very straightforward. So it's like it's a banner, and then I have a grouping capability, and in this case it's a group of one. So if I go down the line, again, there's a few different ways to navigate here, but I can click down the boxes and see what's in them. I also can, as I'm in the boxes and kind of navigating from this view, seeing more detailed, I can see I have iOS banner group. So this is a go-to, so take me there. It's going to walk me down into what's in my banner. In my banner is a CLI command list, so I have iOS banner CLI. I can navigate further into there. Those of you who understand configuring, especially in this case Cisco routers, are going to recognize the CLI. So the beauty of the Gluware system is that for config modeling, we are deconstructing a config file, and then we enable you to kind of put it back together, but as automation policy. So instead of having to kind of try to maintain a template per device, or think of Gluware as a modular template, meaning, this banner, if this banner feature is consistent across every device in my network, I can tie this same banner feature to my assemblies for my branch routers, for my core routers, for my top of rack switches. So it becomes a common component that is used over and over again. And I think that's part of the reason why when you start with Gluware, we start with automating globals, because usually you can get a lot of mileage out of automating and unifying your globals. So as you can see here, we're kind of at Gluware level 100 in terms of complexity, but level 100, we're using static CLI and some minimal variables. But in the case of banner, there are no variables. It just is a block of text. And then we're going to get to something called a concept item. So if you've been following the tutorials to this point, you've heard this term referred to quite a few times. When we onboard a operating system, the fundamental piece of the vendor adapter is to teach our engine how to read or speak natively to that operating system, how to read and how to write. But in the read component, we also take the opportunity to kind of build a dictionary. We teach it a bunch of the features, so not only can it read it and make sure it can read it, but to make sure it can understand it and make sure it can use it and compare it or examine it further. So whenever you look at a concept item, and generally you're not going to edit these very much unless you're getting advanced, but the banner is looking at the config file and understanding how to read out what's configured so that it can compare. So the reason this is so important is you've heard me mention Gluware being intent-based and Gluware being declarative. For all these features, you're declaring the intended state. I want the end state to be this banner. So Gluware has to be able to read current state. So the concept item enables us to read the current state. So when you execute a provisioning, for every feature configured, Gluware is going to read the current state, compare it to the desired state, and then determine what CLI it needs to render at runtime to reach the desired state. So this does include removing commands that are not part of policy, or adding commands that are missing, or fixing commands that are, incorrect. So, if I have a very simple banner or no banner, I will remove it and I will replace it with this, and then Gluware will validate that has changed. So hopefully it's clear. We'll touch back on it a little bit more, but let's go through a few more of these examples. DNS is one that I want to point out, in that if you look at the feature, again, a feature being kind of a bucket of DNS, and then what am I going to automate for DNS? Well, DNS, as I move to the next step, it's actually made up of 3 different individual components or concepts of my DNS server, my domain lookup, and my domain name. So as I look at each one of those, and again, it helps if you know the CLI, I'm configuring my domain name server, I'm explicitly saying no IP domain lookup, and I'm providing the name server list here. So now, to take that a step further, the DNS example gets us into maybe level 1, almost level 200, where we're beginning to introduce variables. Variables are really powerful because if you use a lot of static CLI with the Gluware constructs, you may face more changes and maybe more challenges in terms of always making sure you're in policy. When you start to leverage variables, you can start to abstract a bit, and you can start to operate on a little bit more intelligent level, or at least an abstracted level, which can simplify or minimize changes across lots of constructs. So right now we're introducing variables that are stored right within our own internal system, and they are tied to the feature level. So if I click on the feature and I navigate to configuration, we have kind of a mini data store, and in that data store we're exposing a form, and we have the domain name and the name servers configured here. So this is consistent as you look at others. If I look at NTP, I can either configure it statically, which is what I've done here, or, and you can see it's commented out here, I could point it at the variable. So you're going to be making these decisions when you use Gluware, when to use a variable versus when to use a static value. And it gets even more interesting because variables can come from external sources like an IPAM. Variables could be read from the device itself, so we could execute a command and look at the config or a show statement and then pull out. This is an example here where it's commented out, but it's pointing to a discovered value. And so you can, with Gluware, you can execute a discovery to determine the value of something, and then when you're rendering or configuring, in this case NTP, it is going to discover the variable it should use because it's pulling it from some IP address in the system of a gateway it's pointing to, and that gateway is becoming the NTP server as well. So I don't want to overcomplicate things out of the gate, but just know that Gluware can handle really complex things, and generally the answer as we work with customers and they ask us for more and more complex things, we always say yes, because ultimately Gluware can define any data model for even very complex things. If you've seen our material and our demos on EVP and VXLAN, that's a very complex technology with underlay routing and overlay VXLAN tunneling, and it's quite complicated, and we've fully automated that. And from our heritage, we've automated SDN or SD-WAN from the time we came out as we came out of stealth, so to speak. We were automating Cisco IWAN, which is quite complicated. So that being said, let's just get through this and just highlight, again, as you jump into SNMP, either as you navigate these features, either you're going to see static CLI, or you're going to see CLI that has some variables, kind of holes poked in the CLI that define variables. In this case, all the variables are defined locally, and they reside tied to the feature in our data store and are exposed in a form fill. So That's where the data is stored for all of these. And in this example of this policy, again, we're automating banner, we're automating DNS, we're automating NTP, SNMP, syslog, and the username. So with that being said, let's just say I'm happy with all the values and the variables that I'm automating. Now let's get to some automation. Let's actually make a change. To automate, you're going to want to click on the device, one or more devices, and then come over into the Actions panel and click on Action. And in this case, I have one device selected. You're going to want to be in the Provisioning Utilities. And then instead of just immediately making the change, Gluware has implemented a very useful capability called the Preview. So check Preview Features. So I'm provisioning, Preview, and hit Start Action. And you're going to get, you have three options. Connected is the most popular, and I'll explain why. But in the first option, model validation is basically taking the data models you've described and ensuring all the variable data is there. And if you've tied any dependencies, essentially that everything you've built in the data model is valid. So this is really just a validation step. The next one is an initial rendering. So in an initial, what we're going to do is we're not going to connect to the device and compare. We're going to just take all of these features and just generate the CLI or render the CLI based on all the variables, and you're going to just get the full-blown CLI, everything, all of these features. But that's not necessarily what you want. What you want to know is you want to run in a connected mode because Gluware Engine will connect to the device, in this case, this Spoke 1 router. It will read all of the configured states. It will compare it to the desired state, what you've determined in your policy here, and then it will only make the changes that are required. So again, it will remove what shouldn't be there, add what needs to be added, and correct anything wrong. So let's go ahead and proceed with a preview. And once you've run an action, you're going to want to navigate to the provisioning view. And this is where you have logs. And so I can double click on this log, and by default, it drops me into our kind of detailed log, and you're going to see everything occurring here. And just to remind you, if you haven't seen the other tutorials, and maybe you've looked back, anything highlighted in green like this with white text is a response from the device. And if you click on the cog, you can filter this log, you can change your logging level. There's a lot of settings. But the power here, and again, you don't want to have to comb through these logs and kind of try to decipher everything. So we've made it very easy for you. You click on the CLI view. This shows you only the CLI interactions with the device. So what statements Gluware ran, what the device outputted. When you run a preview, you can also take a look at what we call the processed view. The processed view is what is rendered of all the things I'm trying to do. After I compared it to the device, what do I have to do? So let me just give you the example. And this is good because we're tying it back to the config drift demo where I drifted this Spoke 1 by adding a name server 8.8.8.8. So I took it out of policy by adding that. So what Gluware knows to do is to remove this statement entirely, and then re-add the servers that are part of the policy. Okay, so there it's fixing. So if I could back up a little bit, it doesn't have to do anything for banner. It's going to fix DNS. If I look at NTP, again, if you haven't watched the drift video, I removed the NTP server. So this is going to go back and add in the NTP server. So that's good. There's no changes for SNMP. For syslog, it's fixing the source interface, and for username, it's gonna lay down the usernames, because one of the challenges with if you're automating a feature like username, the passwords are hashed. There's a hash, so you can't read them. So to ensure the configurations are correct for the username, it will reapply that configuration. So I'm good. I like my preview. I'm happy. I can go ahead now. If I go back to the action view, I can take the provisioning, instead of running a preview, I can say provision and hit start. So that the other one, I did not make a change. It was just like, Gluware, tell me what you're going to do. Now I'm going to go ahead and make the change. And one thing I want to point out too is while you're actually running the provisioning, I like to view the grid, and especially when you're running more than one here. In the grid, it's going to tell you exactly what it's doing. So it's automating, feature 1 of 5 is done. It's automating the banner. It's automating DNS. So you can see, even at a high level, at the grid level, without looking at the log, exactly what the engine's doing. But the purpose or the goal of Gluware is to take the desired state you've defined in the in your configuration and synchronize it with the network layer. So to ensure the network is always synchronized with your desired state. And we'll let it run here. It's going to take just another maybe 15-20 seconds. Okay, not even. Okay, so it's provisioned. So that device is totally done, and that device is now has the configuration I want. So let's take a little further look and say, okay, let's say I'm really happy with those global features, as I described here, again, banner and DNS and NTP, and now I want to apply them to spokes 2, 3, and 4. Well, what you can do is you can do a multi-select. So I can shift select devices 1, 2, and 3 here. Let me double click into one of these, and since I've selected multiple devices, and again I'm looking at spoke 2 in the grid, in the node instance map, but I have multiple devices selected. So now I can come over here, and you're going to see this icon. This icon's for a multi-edit. You're going to want to click multi-edit. Multi-edit enables you to make a change across everything you've selected. So you might want to be careful with that, because obviously they don't all have the same IP address or the same name. But what they will all have in this case is I'm going to enable assembly, and I'm going to apply the same example global features to all of those spoke routers and hit save. So now you can see spokes 2, 3, and 4 are assigned that assembly. And again, if I zoom back out of my view here, I'm kind of spot checking it, if you will, but I'm looking at spoke 2. I can see it has all these features. Now I still have spoke 2, 3, and 4 highlighted. I can come over. Let's say I'm already comfortable because I previewed spoke 1 and that changed and I'm comfortable with it. Now I can go ahead and provision and hit start and proceed. And again, I like to, while it's running, if I'm not looking at a log, I like to look at the high level view here, where Gluware in parallel is going to go out and provision all these devices. So this is, again, an initial session to introduce you to config modeling, a fairly basic, let's say, example where we're automating global features that are pretty straightforward, mostly static CLI, some variables that we're storing within Gluware and abstracting to a form. But this is really effective because when you think about making changes in networks and change management, there was just a breach where a lot of organizations had to go and edit SNMP server configurations. And the customers who are using Gluware love it because a few changes in the policy, hit provision, and that change is rolled out to the network. A lot of other companies are struggling, like doing it manually or trying to script it. And scripting is always very challenging because scripting generally is only as good as the script writer wrote. Most scripts don't take the time to write extensive pre-checks and post-checks and validation. They are certainly not declarative. And as soon as you bump into anything out of the realm of what your script was built to take care of, it's not going to be successful. So I've just automated all of those and everything is good. And now I'm in a good state where my spokes 1 through 4 are all automated. And that was really the purpose of this demo, to get you looking at config modeling, get you understanding how to assign an assembly. With that assembly, potentially how to add or remove features. In this case, we didn't really add or remove features, but you could double click into an assembly and you could remove features. If other features are defined and available, I could add them. In a later demo, we'll add more complex things like QoS, for example. but this really gets you going and gets you started. Just to kind of circle back, just to make it interesting here, let's circle back to Drift and Audit. And here I am in the Audit Explorer here, and view my devices. And so let me just select them all here, Control A, and I'm going to run a new snapshot, start. So theoretically, from the changes I made when I drifted Spoke 1, I've remediated those changes. Now, I didn't just, update 2 features. I implemented a bunch of automation. So I want to just make sure or see if I've, remediated or I introduced more changes. And I can see with Spoke 1, 2, 3, and 4, I did introduce more changes. So those have drifted. So let's go ahead and jump into Spoke 1 here. And it's just highlighting or flagging the password change. And this is a little challenging in a way only because it's hashed. So anytime you're changing, you're updating password, if you're automating password, you're going to run into that where it's in a way a false positive because of the hash, you don't know necessarily if that password's been changed or not. So if you leave it in clear text like this one is, then it's not an issue. But anytime you're enabling hashing on those passwords, it could get flagged. Now we could add a rule in Gluware to ignore that, or potentially you could not automate. So I'm sure that's what that is across these guys. So sure enough, all these guys, the only thing that is now it's flagging is that password change. So very easily on these guys, I can just select them and hit star, meaning those are my new updated good configs. Hit confirm, and now I am synchronized and all is good, and I can watch for config changes that are unauthorized. So with that, this concludes the demonstration of config modeling. Thank you for your time.